So, welcome everyone to an evening of talking about honeybees and beekeeping, both in general, but also very specifically in some of the historic conservations and historic homes in the Philadelphia area. We're very, very happy to be hosting tonight Bruce Gill from Harriton House and Chelsea Handler from the Willistown Conservation Land Trust. My name is Elliot Botzetic. I'm here from Main Point Books in Wayne, which is a wonderful independent bookstore right in downtown Wayne. You can, of course, get this book from us, and we would be happy to have you come in. We're open up now for folks to come in, and so we hope to see you in there. And we have other events, both in person again now and also online. So check out our events calendar and keep up to date with what we're hosting and what we're doing. We're going to start off tonight hearing about two local historical sites and the history of beekeeping there, and then turn it over to author Frank Mortimer to talk about his great book about bees and beekeeping. So, Bruce, if you would introduce yourself and talk about Harriton House for us.
Thank you. My name is Bruce Gill, and I am the executive director and curator at Historic Harriton House in Bryn Mawr, and I am the beekeeper there. We actually have a group of about 8 or 10 beekeepers who keep honeybees in the 24-acre park. We have an ongoing beekeeping program. As a matter of fact, taught 2 beekeeping classes this past Saturday and the Saturday prior, and we're scheduled to have our big honey festival and beekeeping festival on the last Saturday in July, and it runs from 11 to 2. And we do a presentation about honeybees, and we have other beekeepers there, and we have bee suits if you want to go down and visit the hives, and there are things for children to do, and we have honey-themed snacks and so forth. So we're pushing our beekeeping program. We got into beekeeping at Harriton House, and there is historic Harriton House, the 1704 building built in Lower Merion Township in Bryn Mawr. It was built on what was originally 700 acres, and it was called Bryn Mawr, means high or great hill. And that's where the name of the town comes from. Our most famous occupant was a character named Charles Thompson. And Charles Thompson was the first and only secretary to the Continental Congresses from 1774 until he did his last job in 1789. And he went to Mount Vernon to collect George Washington to take him to New York to become the first president of the United States of America. Washington promptly turned around and went home. And since there was a new government, everybody in the old government went home. And Charles Thompson was left on his own in New York for about 6 or 8 weeks running the country. When he retired from that, and the new government employees and representatives were arriving in New York, Charles Thompson retired to Harriton. It was actually his wife's property, the property where she was born and grew up. And Thompson was interested in several things in his retirement at Harriton. We use the word retirement, but I think shifting gears at the age of 60 is a little more representative of what he was doing. Charles Thompson was very, very interested in America's principal industry after the American Revolution and what remains Pennsylvania's biggest industry today. Pennsylvania's biggest industry in both product and dollar volume is agriculture. And honeybees are absolutely vital to Pennsylvania agriculture and Pennsylvania's biggest industry. We may know from our 9th grade classes a little more about biology than Charles Thompson did, but he understood that his orchards, his berry crops, his vegetables, and his small grains all did better when there were honeybees on the landscape. He wrote this book called Notes on Farming about 1787 when he was in New York with Congress. He had it published. He had read the works of an Englishman named Arthur Young, who was a progressive farmer, a progressive British farmer, and he incorporated a lot of Young's theories in Notes on Farming. And then at the end, he puts in a whole section on beekeeping. And he writes that honeybees are very useful little animals. And he goes on to talk about their importance on the landscape and on his agricultural landscape. Thompson was also a founder of the Philadelphia Society for Promoting Agriculture, which exists today as the oldest continuously operating agricultural society in the country. And they meet regularly in Philadelphia on a monthly basis. So Charles Thompson had been involved with beekeeping since about 1780, 81, 82. When Congress was in Princeton in 1783, his tenant farmers had apparently knocked over the beehive and it upset them and so on and so forth, and ruined the honey harvest. And Charles Thompson wrote a letter home to his wife, admonishing the farm, telling her to admonish the farmers, telling them to be much, much more careful of these useful little animals. We do have, as I said, an ongoing program. Honeybees have been kept at Harriton House in the 18th century with Charles Thompson, in the 19th century, right up until the Civil War. And we have photographs from the 1890s which show Langstroth hives right next to the front door. So the tenants who were living in the house in the 1890s, early 1900s, were keeping bees on the property. So there's a long, long history of keeping honeybees on the landscape in Lower Merion Township. And I put up our website, harritonhouse.org, or our email, or you can phone the old-fashioned phone number, and you can see our programs and events, and including the beekeeping programs that we have. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bruce. If you would stop your screen sharing, and then Chelsea, if you would jump on and talk with us about beekeeping there.
Give me 1 moment. I do need to be made a co-host.
I'm very sorry. Let me do that.
That's okay.
There you are.
And okay. All right. Can everybody see that? All right. So my name is Chelsea Hick, and I'm the Director of Annual Giving and Outreach at the Willistown Conservation Trust, which is located in Newtown Square. Our sort of area that we work runs all the way from Westchester to Newtown Square to the Malvern area. And at the Trust, we have a few different pieces to our mission. We're really built on land conservation. And so since about the 1970s, working under the Brandywine Conservancy, we've preserved about 7,500 acres of land from development. If any of you have been around the Radnor Hunt area, which is a pretty notable location in Newtown Square, all of those farmlands and horselands are preserved because of the work of the Willistown Trust. And aside from private lands, we also have some public easements and through land acquisitions that we've done, and we have 3 public preserves, Kirkwood, Ashbridge, and then Rushton Woods. With those different lands that we have a pretty robust stewardship program for our habitat work around the area. And we work with private landowners who have everything from working agricultural lands to woodlands to wetlands to help them steward their land in sort of, the best way they can for both plants, humans, and the wildlife that live in the area. More recently, in 2018, we added a watershed protection program because we're uniquely positioned in the headwaters of the Ridley, Crum, and Darby Creek and have about 190 miles of streams within our area. This is Lauren McGrath here, who's looking at some critters in the water. And that plays an important role even when we talk about honeybees and pollinators, is our water quality, because that then also attracts other animals to the area. And so doing water quality research and looking at the wildlife in the stream and around the stream, we're creating a baseline of what the water looks like in Willistown and the headwaters. One of our most popular and well-known programs is our bird conservation program. And over the past 11 years, our team has banded, putting tiny little bracelets on about 15,000 individual birds and 100 different species, all at our Rushton Woods Preserve. And they do banding in the spring and the fall for migratory songbirds. And then also in the fall, they do saw-whet owls. We've also become one of the leading organizations placing towers that you see on that left hand side there. That
Chelsea, the slides aren't going forward for us. We're still seeing the first one.
How do I fix that?
Click on present mode.
I thought I was.
Or just double click on the individual slides as you go down. Either way will open them up for us. There you go.
Here, let's see really quick. If I do. Let me try something else really quick.
Now we have nothing.
Okay. There, does that work?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
Now you're on. Thank you.
All right, sure, sorry about that. Okay, so our bird conservation program, you'll see here on the left-hand side is this MODIS tracking station. Our organization is placing these radio towers up the East Coast. We actually do have full-time staff now in the New England area. And this is to help with a nanotag program. So they are placing these tags on the backs of birds, as well as butterflies and bats and some insects like dragonflies, and being able to track their migration. And this, the Swanson's thrush here, is something that passes through the Rushton Woods, is an insect eater. And so that really ties into how all of these different programs work into our regenerative agricultural program. And so part of the work that we do is at the Rushton Woods Preserve, and this is Rushton Farm. It's an 86-acre preserve with a 6-acre organic farm that is very active, as you can see. It has a 120-person CSA program, and then we also donate about 15% of our yields to the Westchester Food Cupboard and the Chester County Food Bank. And you'll notice that, you know, this isn't what you would think of when you think of like Oklahoma or the plains of agriculture. You'll notice that we have a lot of woodlands, and also around all of our gardens, we make sure that we have native plant gardens planted. We call these our farmers' meadows. On the right-hand side is actually one of the plots that's in the almost middle of our farming fields, and those are our native cup plants, and things like Amsonia and coneflower and bergamot. And then here's our little shameless plug for our Wildflower Week, which is July 17th through the 25th, and that's something you can come and do some self-guided tours. So all of this sort of plays into the important role of how we beekeep. We do have honeybees on our farm, but mainly the way that we steward the land is to support our native pollinators, so our native bee populations that we have here in Pennsylvania. And what's very cool is that in 2012, I believe it was, a Penn graduate student did some research and identified a number of 49 different species of native bees at Rushton Woods on our vegetables that we grow there. We do about 140 varieties of vegetables and fruits. And then this is another picture here of birds nesting. So when we do what's called agroecology, is that we're working the land in harmony with the natural environment around us. And so that's sort of our version of beekeeping at Willistown. And they're just some of the native bees that we have here. I could go on and on about native bees, but I'll turn it over.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. And so the main event of the evening, and then we'll have some time for a conversation afterwards, is beekeeper and author Frank Mortimer here to talk about his book, Bee People. So Frank, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm very excited to be talking to the Philadelphia audience because of the rich history of beekeeping in the area, your area. That first of all, that honeybees were first noted to come into North America because honeybees are not native. So all the European colonists brought them over. So it's dating back to the early 1600s when the Swedish immigrants came over and settled in the Delaware Bay area. So through that part of Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware around the Bay, that there's records of them bringing their bees over. And then of course, the Grand Slam and why Philadelphia will always remain the star of modern beekeeping is because in 1851, Reverend Langstroth discovered the modern hive, which is now used around the world. And what he discovered is what we call bee space, and that in between comb, and be this in wild or in man-made hives now, that bees will leave 3/8 of an inch between the honeycomb they build. So kind of like think of our houses, we have standard size hallways. So the bees build these standard hallways and they leave them as hallways and don't connect the comb across. So because of that, we're able to move the frames out of the hive, inspect it, or remove the honey and put the comb back in. So it's better for the bees. And by him doing that, that revolutionized and made it effective that commercial beekeepers could exist. And that the better news is that all of us could eat more honey. And so to get into my book, Bee People and the bugs they love and how I got into it. And I'm just across the river in New Jersey. So a lot of what I talk about would be familiar to a lot of you folks over in Philly. So the things that I like to have all my audiences remember when it comes to bees, there's two main points. The first is that honeybees and yellow jackets are completely different creatures. That think of it like domestic dogs and hyenas. They may look similar, but they're completely different. The way to tell the difference is honeybees are fuzzy, and actually all bees are fuzzy, and yellow jackets and wasps are smooth. So they look like they're made of plastic. So what I like to say is fuzzy is good, plastic is bad. The second thing is that 1/3 of all the food we eat is thanks to the pollination efforts to the honeybee. And what's also interesting is that all of these foods are also not native to North America. So they were also brought over by the European colonists. And what I think is interesting about that is that you think about, America is the land of milk and honey, and neither bees nor cows are native to North America. The same is true that Washington chopped down a cherry tree, not native. Apples with Johnny Appleseed, not native. But all the good tasting fruit, and that's why people brought bees with them, is so they could have the food to eat. But all of this great stuff is because of the honeybee. And in the US, it represents over $20 billion a year in crops, thanks to the honeybee. So how did I get into beekeeping? I went to a lecture at my local library, and I'm in the part of New Jersey that's outside of New York, and which is the most densely populated county in New Jersey. And so when I was surprised that there was a lecture on beekeeping, because it's something I always wanted to do and had never made the jump. And so when I went to this lecture, the room was filled, and I was really surprised that there were that many other people that were also interested in beekeeping as myself. And the main thing I learned when I was there is that there was a club. And that's always my first advice for anybody that wants to start beekeeping, is join a local beekeeping club, because you'll find mentors that can help you along the way. So I joined the club, and that's how I started my journey. And so I'm going to read you something real short about how I actually got my first bees. Instead of being part of installing my first hive in my backyard, my official start to beekeeping came via a series of text messages from Sarah, my son's babysitter. Days before, when I told Sarah that I was going to become a beekeeper and start keeping bees in the backyard, I got the look. Something I would see time and time again when I told someone about my new hobby. The look is a facial expression that, regardless of one's native language, is understood to mean, "Are you effing kidding me?" Sarah was overly dramatic about everything from breakfast foods to coordinating her outfits with my son's crayon selections, so news of me getting bees really sent her over the edge. As I sat stuck on a train somewhere outside of Secaucus, the text from Sarah went something like this. "There's a bright yellow car in the driveway and 2 strange men in the backyard." "Oh, those must be the guys from the bee club bringing me my bees." "Eek! Are all the windows closed? Can bees fly down the chimney? Ack! What should I do?" "Relax. You have nothing to worry about. Nothing bad is going to happen." "There's a huge cloud of smoke in the backyard. They're burning down the yard." "No, they lit their smoker. You use smoke to keep bees calm." What kind of smoke make bees mellow? What are they burning in there?" "Probably pine needles." "Oh, now they're carrying a box with a shiny silver top through the backyard. The fat guy's yelling at the old guy saying he's using too much smoke. The old guy's telling him to relax, and he's puffing even more smoke at him. The old guy just pulled a screen off the box. Now he's puffing even more smoke. The fat guy's dancing around, slapping himself. He's yelling about waiting until he wasn't standing in front of the hive. Now the fat guy's running through the backyard screaming, 'I'm hit, I'm hit, got my ear, got my ear.' The old guy is laughing. Now they're both leaving the backyard. Someone's ringing the front doorbell. It's them. They told me to tell you that the beehive's in and they're leaving. I can see the stinger hanging from the fat guy's ear. Ooh." And about the same time Sarah was hyperventilating on the living room floor, I received a single text message. "Bees are in the backyard. It was a piece of cake. Everything went smoothly. Good luck." At last, I had a hive in my backyard, and it made me smile. It was something I always wanted, and now I could finally call myself a beekeeper. And then after a few years, I became president of the club, and I wanted to think of ways that I could improve it. And to include any kind of club, you need 2 things. You need more money so you can do stuff, and you need more members that want to have this stuff happen. So to get money, I realized the answer was bee talks. And, same in Philly, there's so many different towns in Jersey and organizations, and all of them wanted to hear about bees, as all of you are tonight. And so I kept doing these bee talks, and I would do it to raise money for my club. And the more talks I did, the better it made me at speaking about bees. And also it made me a better beekeeper, because I had to, if I didn't know the answer to something, I had to go back to the books to understand what the person was asking. So next time I could answer it. And by just saying it over and over again, then I really was able to develop my explanations. And what's great about this is all of those bee talks I did, which are now over 175, is what was the foundation for my book, because I learned how to say things so people could understand it, and also put me in front of more people so I had more funny stories to tell. And see, there's a beekeeping joke, but it's actually the truth. If you ask 3 beekeepers a question, you're going to get 4 answers. And what was happening at the club was that there was all these differing opinions on what should happen and what you should do. And then this is when the rise of YouTube really came out. And so there was a lot of bad advice on what beekeepers were getting, and it was based on people's opinions and not science. And so what I realized is, as the president of the club, I really wanted to do something that would set me apart and prove that I knew what I was talking about. And what I realized is I needed to go to Cornell University's Master Beekeeping program. And I signed up for the course on February 8th, 2017. And I'm not crazy with dates, but I know that was the date because that was the day that my youngest daughter was born. because I actually signed up for the class while my wife was in the delivery room in early labor. And as all beekeepers will tell you, we don't always talk about bees because sometimes we're asleep. And this is a prime example of that, so here it was, we're in the hospital, and, it's like I said, it was early labor. So my wife was euphoric about the moment. And I'm like, hey, that Cornell program opens up today. And she's like, oh, go ahead and sign up. So thanks to that, thanks to my younger daughter, I will always remember the date of when I signed up. And for those that want to know what a master beekeeper is, I'm not supposed to tell this, but I will explain to you what the true test of a master beekeeper is. Being able to drink your coffee through your bee veil, most important thing in the morning. But no, seriously, the course comprises of 4 separate programs that take 15 months to complete. And each course ends with a final project. And the final project for the first course was that you had to write an outline for how to give a bee talk to a non-beekeeper. And I was like, holy smokes, I've been doing this for years, and I was able to really write that quickly. And then I got a lot of positive feedback from my instructor. And that was really the light bulb that went off for me, that assignment, because it gave me the confidence to know that I knew what I was talking about. And I turned that outline into an article for Bee Culture magazine, which is one of the most respected and oldest bee journals in the US. And then the publisher said it was filled with lots of good information. So he published it, and I was so excited I wrote 2 more, and he published those as well. So I went from never submitting anything for publication to getting 3 articles published in less than a year. And more important than that is that I was getting a lot of positive feedback, that people were telling me how much they enjoyed my story. So I kept writing them, and I like to make people laugh, and I like to teach people things. And so hearing that was working really made me feel good. And that's why I decided to write my biggest and best story, which is my book, Bee People and the Bugs They Love. And here's what a few folks are saying about the book, that Harlan Coben, who's currently a #1 New York Times bestselling author, with Win is his most recent book. And he said that, and I love this quote because it's filled with dad jokes. And he's such an important author. And to have dad jokes makes me happy on so many levels. So he says, bee people and the bugs they love is the bee's knees and getting a ton of buzz. Be smart, people, and read this unbelievable, interesting look at the quirky world of beekeeping. The New York Times also said it was a very good book and achievement to convey so much knowledge so accessibly without once seeming overbearing. And that's, like I said, what is important to me is to explain things that people can understand. And then the San Francisco Book Review, the reviewer said, this ranks among the best written books I've ever reviewed, and includes great humor and use of allegory to reveal tremendous amounts of knowledge. And bee people are weird and a fascinating lot. And I am proof of that myself. And the author delves deeply enough into the eccentricities to make for a fascinating read. And the thing that's important, a lot of people are like, well, what makes your book so special? And I want to be clear, it's not a how-to book. It's more of a laugh at my mistakes book. So I'm going to read to you one of my favorite mistake stories. Most of my monumental mistakes usually began with me saying, let me just do this real fast. Whenever I think I'll just move at a faster speed or that I'll get something done zippity quick is when the bees remind me that why it's always better for me to take my time and never ever rush. The first time my soon-to-be wife experienced her first bee sting was when I said, I need to feed one of my hives some syrup. I'll be quick. Let me do this real fast. Then, because I was focused on working fast instead of watching what I was doing, I made a series of mistakes that led to my surprise that she still married me, soon-to-be wife, getting stung on her right thigh. Since I was going to be moving fast, I thought I'd skip lighting the smoker, which led to alarm pheromones getting released and putting the bees on high alert. Next, I haphazardly laid the inner cover, which was covered in a fair number of bees, against the side of the hive. And when I went to pour the syrup into the hive feeder, I bumped into the inner cover, causing it to topple over and land on my never screamed but couldn't believe what I had done, surprised that she still married me, soon-to-be wife's feet. Once the inner cover hit the ground, the bees become airborne, and the one that landed on my bride's thigh decided that she had had enough. Thankfully, once my so much smarter than me, never screamed but couldn't believe what I had done, surprised that she still married me, soon to be wife realized that she had been stung. She immediately walked away from the hives, went back to the car, and waited until I was done. Now, whenever she accompanies me to the hives, the first thing she says is, "Did you light your smoker?" And that's just one of many, many mistakes that I made. Because you know what they always say is that you can learn from your mistakes. So my mistakes are so big that I'm hoping that I can have a whole country of beekeepers learn from them. And what else is fun about my books is I talk about my different experiences with different people, the people who willingly choose to be around stinging insects, which does take a certain breed of person to want to do that. And I want to talk about that type of person. And here's something from my New Jersey bee meeting. Probably the most important listing in the newsletter was information about the upcoming state beekeeper meeting. As soon as I saw it, I sent in my registration check for $25. The meeting was being held about 2 hours away, closer to Philadelphia than to New York. Even though the state of New Jersey may not be the geographically biggest state, it is quite diverse and can be divided into 4 mindsets: New York suburbs, Philadelphia suburbs, farmland, and down the shore, which is anywhere on the Jersey's 100 plus miles of beach. If you're not from Jersey, most of your information about it has probably come from one of the reality TV shows that was filmed within its borders, which captures some local stereotypes but is far from what it's really like to live here. What surprises most people about New Jersey is that it really is the Garden State, as it has 9,000 farms covering 720,000 acres. And its biggest crops are blueberries, cranberries, and tomatoes. New Jersey has everything from a pygmy pine forest to the Appalachian Trail to the second largest waterfall east of the Mississippi River. And no matter where they live, most New Jerseyans love all the natural settings their state has to offer. I arrived at the bee meeting bright and early so I'd be in line for the 7:30 a.m. check-in. The meeting was being held at Rutgers University's Eco Complex, which is on a Rutgers satellite campus in Bordertown, New Jersey, and focuses on the environment and agriculture. Everyone that I met was super friendly, and it was easy to see that most of these people had known one another for years. I didn't see anyone from our club, so I grabbed a coffee and a bagel and just walked around the atrium before heading into the meeting room. Within 30 minutes, the auditorium was full and every one of the 150 seats was taken. I was amazed to think that all these people had woken up at the crack of dawn on a Saturday morning just to listen to someone talk about bees. I had found my tribe. I looked around the room and thought of the children's book, Go Dog Go. Only instead of big dogs, little dogs, red dogs, blue dogs, all at the dog party, this was tall beekeepers, short beekeepers, male beekeepers, female beekeepers, fat beekeepers, skinny beekeepers, old beekeepers, young beekeepers, all at the bee meeting. There were just as many women as men, just as many couples as singles. The more I scanned the room, the more I realized that there was not one type of person who kept bees. Beekeepers come in all sizes, shapes, genders, colors, and ages. The only thing anyone seems to have in common was that they kept bees. And that's what I love about beekeepers is that I think that I've met some of my best friends through beekeeping. And it's kind of like this international fraternal order that anywhere you go, if you meet another beekeeper, you have the commonality of keeping bees that brings you together and you're able to talk. And I also think that beekeeping, you know, at its heart, what it is you're nurturing a big ball of stinging insects. And so it's not like, you know, having a pet dog or a cat, which will show you affection in return. The bees don't do that. And so I think to be a beekeeper, you have to have this nurturing gene because it's not like you're going to be able to cuddle on the couch with them. And that's why I think beekeeping is great for families. It's something that my whole family does together. These are my kids. I started when my son was like 4, and then both my daughters, who are much younger, both held bees, and on one of those frames can be up to 4,000 bees, and they both held them when they were 3 years old. And beekeeping is what defines my family. It's what we do together. You know, some people might go out back and shoot hoops or play golf together, but we like to go visit the hives, bottle honey, and just do something bee related. And that's why I'm proud to call myself a bee people, because I love my bee people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. I love your enthusiasm. Bees are amazing. So do we have questions, especially Chelsea and Bruce, um, questions or sort of further topics of conversation? Um, just to kick it off, Frank, could you talk a little bit about beekeeping in urban areas? Like, I know folks in Manhattan have bees, folks in Philly have bees. Like, how's that been changing as people catch on and realize just how wonderful this is?
Yeah, and it's and it dates back because like if you look at European cities, like Paris has had bees for a long time, and some of the buildings were actually built with keeping hives in mind. Like before the Langstroth, they used to use skeps, which were those upside down baskets, and so in buildings they would build spaces where you could store those skeps. And when like the church, when the Notre Dame burnt down, that they had hives on the roof, which is something they've done for centuries, and the bees survived. So having bees in urban settings is an old time tradition, and it's great that it's getting a comeback. And anecdotally, many people say that honey from European or from urban hives is tastier, because you think of like how many people plant different kinds of flowers, and so the combination of tastes from all those different flowers leads to better tasting honey.
And I can chime in a little bit. I was lucky enough to keep bees. St. Joe's University, which is right on the cusp of Philadelphia and Lower Merion on City Avenue in Philadelphia. I was able to keep bees on the top of their science center, which was I had to take an elevator up, which was always fun. Luckily there was an elevator, but we would take bees up through the elevator and we would have them on the green roof they had there. And like Frank was saying, at one point I kept bees in the Wissahickon Park, and a Penn student had taken the honey and did a pollen analysis. And so I was able to see that it was mostly the large trees, those canopy trees, that the honey was from. And then they were doing research on the honey in West Philly. And it was mainly, like you said, the flowering, window box flowers, and the small Woodland Cemetery had a great, people were keeping gardens there. So it was pretty interesting to see how diverse the pollen was within the honey. If you want to go that geeky and get into your pollen analysis.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when you think about it, so for everyone in a bee's lifetime, it will only make 1/12 of 1 teaspoon of honey. So it means every time you sweeten your tea, it took 12 bees' life to make that honey. So if you extrapolate on that, it takes just under 1,200 bees to make 1 pound of honey. And to make that 1 pound of honey, the bees had to visit 2 million flowers. And the flight miles combined to visit those 2 million flowers is 56,000 miles, which is twice around the equator. And that's for 1 pound. And the whole reason that bees make honey is so that the colony has food to eat through the winter. And in our region, each beehive will need between 60 and 80 pounds of honey for themselves to make it through the winter. So then you take that number times 80, right? But then it even gets more, because after they've made the honey for themselves is when the beekeeper puts the boxes on to get honey for themselves. And it's just amazing, the math about how much work goes into for the bees to produce all that.
Would you talk a little bit about some other trends that you've been seeing that are new in the ways that people are thinking about hives, especially I know with commercial agriculture and the problem with bees getting so sick that people are having to rethink some of the things, like trucking bees across the country, it turns out is a bad idea. What other kinds of
Sure.
challenges or changes do you see?
So the main thing, since you brought up why are bees getting sick or why are they dying? So there's a parasitic mite called Varroa destructor. It's a non-native parasite to the European honeybee. It jumped species in the 60s, and it came to the US in 1987. Varroa destructor is now everywhere across the globe that honeybees are, except for Australia and Newfoundland. So it's it's in New Zealand and it's in Hawaii. So that's the number one problem. And what the mites do is that they feed on the developing baby bees. So the mite sucks the nutrients out of that developing bee. So if you think of like prenatal nutrition, and imagine if there was a parasite sucking off the nutrients before that baby was born, of how it would be weaker when it was. More important than that, as horrible as that sounds, that the mites are also a vector for bee diseases. And to be clear, this is diseases that only affects bees, not people. But as we're living through this pandemic, you can understand how they can spread diseases more efficiently. And even though I keep trying to get my bees to wear little pollen masks, they refuse. So the mites are a problem. So when the mites first were affecting bees because they weren't carrying as many of these viruses, then hives could handle a higher mite load. But now, because the number of viruses that they keep carrying increases, that it takes less mites to kill a colony of bees. So like a good example is like you think about mosquitoes, like when they first started carrying West Nile virus, we're like, West Nile. And then more recently, when we heard about Zika virus, same bug, but it's carrying more diseases. So the same thing with these mites. And as you brought up, that with the pollination events, that's how the bees are in a closer proximity. And what's interesting with that is that almonds, 80% of the world's almonds come from this one area in Northern California that's about the size of Rhode Island. And almonds are 100% dependent upon honeybees to bloom, or for the blooms to be pollinated to turn into almonds. And so every February, 2 out of every 3 hives in the US, think about that, 2 out of every 3 beehives in the US goes to Northern California to pollinate the almonds. And if you think about how we've been learning how to socially distance and stay away from each other, and here we're taking 2/3 of the population, put it in a very confined area, and then that's how these mites were able to pick up so many more viruses and why they become more deadly. So yeah, so the mite is the number one thing, and that's why and I talk about it in my book too, that it's important for beekeepers to treat for the mites, so that way they can overcome it, because it's and so a big way that beekeeping changed, to also answer your question, is that pre-1987 beekeepers didn't have to worry about varroa, and it was actually when you talk to people that kept bees back then, it was much easier to keep bees because they didn't have to worry about all this stuff. Now at beekeeping meetings, the big joke is we talk more about mites than we do about bees.
For those of us who benefit from the bees but don't keep them ourselves, but eat not just the honey but the fruit and the agriculture, what are things that we can do to help support both honeybees and also, of course, native bees, which are incredibly important pollinators, and people don't always understand the difference between those?
So you faded out for a second. So I heard you. You asked 2 things. If I want to make sure, one is what can everybody do to support honeybees, and 2, what about honeybees versus native pollinators? Correct.
Right.
So
and how to support both.
So the number one thing that you can do to support honeybees is find your local beekeeper and buy their honey. Because if you're not going to keep bees, finding the guy down the street that does, and by you buying his honey, that enables him to maintain the bees and keep going, which will benefit you. Even if wherever you live, it's not even in agriculture, honeybees do pollinate everything around you. So like if you want your yard to look good, you need that pollinated. So number 1, support your local beekeeper. Number 2, let a few dandelions grow. I'm not saying let your entire lawn become dandelions, but if everybody just let a few grow, then that's one of the first things that bloom, and the bees can go to the dandelions to get some nectar and pollen. And the third thing is that you should plant native perennials. And the reason for that is that if they're native, it will also attract the native bees that you're referring to. And when you plant those, plant them in clusters, because bees like to go where there's the best food source. They want to utilize they make it more efficient. So if you're planting native perennials in like a 3-foot ball or 3-foot area, as opposed to spreading them out throughout your yard, they're more likely to go to that. The last thing would be to reduce / eliminate the chemicals that you put on your lawn. You just, if everybody, I don't think you should use them at all, but if everybody cut back on the chemicals, then that's going to help all pollinators, because when you're the problem, especially in suburban and urban areas, is people see weeds and it might say one spray, and people put a whole gallon on it, and all of that runs into the ground and then into different water sources. So you're really having a detrimental effect by doing it. So those are the ways to do it.
Elliot, this is Hannah. Could you open the chat box so you can see what I've been writing, questions for the different speakers?
I am not having anything showing up in my chat box. Do you want to just jump in and ask them out loud? You certainly can.
Yeah.
I think you might have sent them maybe just to me or just directly to each of us.
Oh, is that what I did? They were all like personal questions. I didn't realize it wasn't for everyone.
Well, we certainly, Chelsea, Frank, Bruce, if there are questions you want to answer, please share the question with all of us and then jump right in and answer it.
Sure. She asked one, do I avoid almonds because of my knowledge? And the answer is no. It's like I don't believe that you should shame commercial farming, because it's that's how we're preparing food, and we've chosen to do that. So it's like it would be a bigger shift, and not just the almonds. And I certainly don't blame the commercial beekeepers, because they're just supporting this whole food chain. And also, commercial beekeepers actually are really passionate about making their bees healthy. And so they're more of the good guys, because they're on the front line, and then they have to stay up on the science and figure out what's best to do. So now, if you ask me, do I think that the U.S. should change all of its farming policies to match more of Europe, then I'd say yes. But it's such a big thing that I'm not going to single out one food type because of it.
Thanks for that.
And I had a quick question about tagging birds and insects to learn about their migratory paths, which it sort of does feed into all of, even talking about honeybees and habitat and our native bee populations. So our team is big on birds, and so we set up nets that in the early morning hours, and the birds fly into them, and they softly fall in and get stuck, and they sit there, and we pull them out. They measure them, they take, they ID them, weigh them, and then tag them and release them. And so we have that data. And with insects, and so the biggest, I want to say the charismatic megafauna of insects is the monarch butterfly. And I think bees have sort of caught up with, the world has sort of caught on that bees are really important. But the monarch still, I think, holds with its migratory patterns that it has, and the loss of habitat with the milkweed plants. So they are tagging them, and then with the telemetry tags, when they pass a tower, it picks up where they're going. So there's a great website, motus.org, MOTUS, and you can actually see them tracking insects and birds and bats around the world.
I find it mind-boggling that you have such tiny sensors.
Yes, and unfortunately, they're very expensive. So the technology is catching up with it, but the traditional banding, which is the little silver bracelet with a number where you have to recapture an animal to identify it, is still the main way that science is working. But the tiny little tags are out there. And
around an insect's leg?
No, so the tag goes on the back. The telemetry tag goes on the back of the insects. So
how do you attach it?
They use a biodegradable glue.
Oh.
So it's like a little back.
There's a study just came out with tagging bees. So what's interesting, so honeybees, they mate up in the air. So you think of these, they're called drone congregation areas, and think of them as like single bars for bees. And so all these drones, the males or the drones, go up to these areas and they fly around and wait for a queen to come. And when a queen comes, she'll mate with up to 24 drones on her mating flight. And so just recently a study was published where they put the sensors on the drones so they could follow them and to see, you know, which of the, how they would go to these congregation areas. And one of the interesting things that came out of that is that just like guys at a single bar, if one drone congregation area isn't working, the drones will try other ones. And it just, so that was kind of the new bee news of late that ties into the tagging.
Frank, what are a few of the best and most interesting honeys that you've tried as you've traveled around?
Great question, and especially because it's new. So there's a plant. So I'm going to back up. Honey's taste and color is 100% dependent upon what flowers or plant it went to. And so, and what's interesting is like you can have hives in the same location, like mine are, but then the taste of honey will vary. Like, because I'll harvest in June and then again in July, because different things are blooming, the honey tastes differently. And then, like as Chelsea said, in suburbia, most of the honey comes from trees. So like linden trees, which were planted to look nice on streets, and black locusts are two of the big pollinators. So the most interesting honey, I just tried this, so thank you for asking. There's a plant that grows out in Oregon, and it's called meadow foam, white meadow foam, if you Google it. And apparently they named it that because in the forest, that when it's these little white flowers, and it kind of looks like sea foam running through the forest. And so here's, drum roll please, that when you try this honey, it tastes 100% like marshmallows. And it was fantastic. Yeah, so meadow foam honey is marshmallows.
Is it green?
No.
Oh, that is so fascinating.
Yeah. And something that's a little closer to our area is in central Jersey, is butter beans. So think of like those brown lima beans. Mm-hmm. And then the honey from that plant is very light and very sweet. So I also like that as well. And I find it interesting that honey, like, you know, in South Jersey, they get blueberry and cranberry honey. And why each of those have a distinct flavor, they don't taste like the fruit. They only, but you can still identify them apart from each other. And Pennsylvania, buckwheat honey is a big seller as well.
Yeah, that's strong.
Right. Buckwheat, which blooms in September, is real dark and strong. And it kind of, I think it kind of tastes like molasses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Chelsea, you've talked about lanternfly honey and just a little bit, and I don't know, just since 'tis the season, if you can talk a little bit about lanternfly honey.
Well, I haven't had, I don't know, Frank, if you've gotten a chance to try the lanternfly honey, yeah. But Bruce, yeah, one of the interesting things that my mother is German and we love Black Forest honey. Yeah. And a woman was selling it to us talking about the bee lice, the tree lice. And I was like, what are tree lice? And she meant aphids. And that was, you know, something I then had to say, you can't tell Americans tree lice. Yeah. Nobody's going to want that. But so aphids are a tiny bug that then create what's called a honeydew in their stomach by drinking the sap. And the bees use that honeydew to then make honey. And I believe that's the same method that's used with the lanternfly honey. So it's a little bit of a distinct flavor, the Black Forest honey. And just a kind of an interesting way that bees have adapted to still create honey. And I don't know, Bruce.
Tastes sort of has sort of a barbecue flavor, smoky, dark barbecue. I don't like it much, but.
And that's such a great way to show how beekeepers making lemonade out of lemons. As destructive as the lanternfly is, you know, if we can get something sweet from it, then it's good, or better than totally horrible, I should say.
Do we have any other questions here as we're coming up on the hour? Well, Frank, I want to thank you so much for coming, and also Bruce and Lindsay and Chelsea to talk with us, and both about bees and also about these wonderful, rich historic sites and land trusts. Um, Keeping alive those traditions and earlier ways of farming and keeping open land of native pollinators is unbelievably important in how we move forward, sort of as a culture that learns to live with the natural world. I just want to close with a quick history of bees from a community that I participate in. There's an old tradition called telling the bees, where people who actually lived on the kind of farms we used to have, where you'd have cows and sheep and vegetables, and you'd make your own sausage. And so that it was not monocrops, you had these very rich agricultural environments, and people had beehives, and you knew that you had to live with the beehives. So when somebody died, you would go tell the bees and maybe even wrap black crepe around the hives. And when somebody got married, you would tell the bees and you would bring them cake. If somebody was, moving or leaving or a child being born, whatever happened in the human family, you had to go tell the bees about in order to keep good luck, good agriculture, keep the bees from leaving you, keep the bees there. So in my community, we make that a habit of once a year when we say Mourner's Cottage, we go outside and tell the bees about who we've lost that year. That took a long time, a year ago. If we have major changes in our community, we, go outside and, find some bees and talk to them. None of us keep hives, but you can always find some bees somewhere and tell the bees about it. So that sense of, even if you don't keep beehives, there are ways that you can make sure you're practicing a kind of connection to the world of bees other than just consuming their product. So I want to encourage that lovely old tradition of telling the bees.
It's fantastic.
Thank you, Elliot.
It's a beautiful way for those of us who don't do agriculture to still stay connected to the broader natural world as something more than just a consumer of things. And also, as Frank said, find your local apiarists and buy their local honey. So Frank, thank you so much. The book is, of course, for sale at Main Point, because having local bookstores is like having native bees. You really need to have those in your environment. So thanks so much, everyone. And we will have this recording. Right. And we will have this recorded and have that up on our YouTube channel as soon as we can. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining in tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, absolutely. What a total delight. What a lovely way to learn about places I need to visit now. So,
Frank, I enjoyed your book too.
Oh, thank you very much.
Somebody had to say that.
Right. Thank you for saying that, Bruce.
We haven't read it yet.
I really, having been through all the scientific stuff, I really enjoyed the fact that it was non-scientific. It was written for people, not scientists.
Yes. Thank you. That's exactly correct.
It's wonderful. It's great. All right. Thanks very much.
Frank, if you just have a moment, my daughter Ula has a question. No question?
Well, Ula, let me tell you something. So I have two daughters, and they're now 6 and 4, and they come help me with the bees all the time.
That was one of the questions. Is how old do you have to, go ahead.
How old do you have to be to do beekeeping?
In my family, 3. That both my daughters, when they were 3 years old, that's when they started helping me with bees.
That's great.
Come visit Harriton House, and I have little people bee suits.
Oh my God.
That's so cute.
What a photo op and learning opportunity that would be. We'd love to. Thank you, Bruce.
Could bees get germs from people, and do people get germs from bees?
No.
Okay.
Simple, clear answer. Thank you all so much. Remember, go to Harriton House and check out the dates on their bee festival. And thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Philadelphia. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.